Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the Hilaritas podcast. Join me here and now as we explore the vast world of iconic writer, psychedelic psychologist, rebel philosopher, and self-proclaimed agnostic mystic, Robert Anton Wilson. Visit us at hilaritaspress.com/podcast for show notes, links, and past episodes. With the release of the Hilaritas Press edition of Reality is What You Can Get Away With, it is my great pleasure to share with you my chat with multimedia artist and raw chauffeur, Joseph Matheny. Joe or Joseph Matheny, welcome to the Hilaritas podcast.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so we're put this together because we have the Hilaritas release of Reality is What You Can Get Away With, and you wrote the introduction to that. You have some little stories there. You were in the thick of it with Bob and a whole cast of characters.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Especially right about the time that book came out. It was, I think, right after he moved from Los Angeles to Santa Cruz. And
Okay.
I had moved to Santa Cruz couple years before, maybe year and a half before. So yeah, we kind of collided. I already knew Bob from Chicago. I'd met him in Chicago, and then I moved from Chicago. On my way to Berkeley was my intention, and stopped in Santa Cruz and never left.
Nice.
So I never made it to Berkeley, not to live.
Yeah, for a few years there during the .com bubble, I was traveling to the Bay or to Silicon Valley about every 3 weeks, and I had to reserve my hotel room like 3 weeks in advance.
Yeah.
And I didn't do that one time. I ended up staying in Santa Cruz because that's the only hotel they could find, and that place was magical.
You could do worse, especially back in the day. Pre-earthquake was even better, but it held on. It held out during the .com era for a long time, and then it eventually succumbed to high prices, and a lot of people that were Santa Cruz natives aged out or left. They left right after the earthquake. We had a giant exodus. Of course, there were people that were panicked because that was a big earthquake, and you saw what it did to San Francisco and Oakland, and we were in the epicenter. Like, the epicenter was 13 miles south in Aptos.
Oh, no kidding.
So yeah, it wiped out the city. Like the downtown area of Santa Cruz was just a devastation. It looked like a war zone. And a lot of people just panicked and left. So I didn't. I stuck it out. Yeah, and then .com happened, and then a lot of people, saw their brass ring. They're like, well, I bought this house in the 60s for $30,000, and somebody just offered me $2 million. Probably you're pushing in retirement age if you're not retired already. And I see how it would be hard to pass up.
The thing that struck me, this must have been like maybe a Tuesday night in 2000 or so, and I wandered down to the beach, and there was like bonfires on the beach, and people just hanging out.
Yep. Yeah, I lived on the beach all the way till I think about 2003. My place was 2 blocks up from the beach, just even with the boardwalk.
Nice.
So the funny story is, I met Bob in Chicago he gave a lecture, and I met him at the lecture, and he bummed a cigarette off of me afterwards because I was probably the only guy in the Zen Center who was standing in the front and smoking. And then he comes out and bums a cigarette, and he tells me, if you ever meet my wife, don't tell her that I bummed a cigarette from you. And I did meet Arlen later, so I didn't tell her. And that wasn't the last cigarette he bummed off of me. And then I was on this journey and it had to do with like like everybody at that point. I was going through my Valis phase,
Mm.
and I was reading High Frontiers at the time. I think they called it out of Berkeley, which became Reality Hackers, and then it became Mondo 2000. So I was reading all that stuff. I was reading Philip K. Dick, and everything was saying Berkeley, Berkeley, Berkeley to me for some reason.
Mm.
And I said to Bob at the when I met him, we talked a while, and I said, I'm really getting into this computer programming stuff, and everything I'm reading is pointing to Berkeley. I'm like, like you've lived out there. What do you think? And he's like, yeah, I think you should go to Berkeley. I'm like, okay. So I did, and I ended up stopping in Santa Cruz. Like I said, I stopped for gas and coffee at a cafe that had a picture of J.R. Bob Dobbs on the door. And in 1989,
That's
that was unusual. Like it was still Subgenius was pretty underground still at that point. And I ended up staying, and I moved to the first apartment that I could find on the beach, and that was that place from the boardwalk. I met my neighbors, and so my neighbors were the downstairs neighbor was Timothy Leary's former assistant and secretary Millbrook. The guy upstairs from me was a friend of Gordon Wasson and Albert
mm.
Hoffman and the McKenna brothers. So it was like this nexus. This building was like full of psychedelic people, and they were connected psychedelic people. And I felt like I landed somewhere by accident that I was really intending to be, but I didn't know when I went there. I was like, I'm going to go to Berkeley and find these people. I'm going to find the others. And I ended up in Santa Cruz finding the others. So, and that was really cool. So, um, and then Bob, I didn't know he had kids in Santa Cruz, and I found that out. And then we talked on the phone. He said, yeah, Arlen and I are going to move up there, be near the kids. And I'm like, all right, something's happening here. It's like I moved to Santa Cruz, I find the right building by accident for the right people, and then Bob tells me he's moving here. So like something's happening in Santa Cruz. It's a nexus, and we're being attracted here to do something weird. So I'm down with that. I'm down with the high
Yeah.
weirdness.
Right, right. You found exactly what you were looking for, but not really where I mean, just by happy
By
accident.
absolutely no strategy on my part because honestly, I'd never heard of Santa Cruz until I stopped for gas. I I came from Chicago. I followed the Route 66 Chicago to Santa Monica route because that was the endpoints, Chicago, Santa Monica. And I
Oh,
got
wow.
maps and everything, and I found the old places where like this is called Highway 15, but it's really the old 66. So I did the historic 66 tracking, and I took 2 weeks. I took my time. I stopped and camped along the way and sightsee, tourist trap things. I just did it all. And I tried to find the weirdest things, that we could see on the road. So like giant ball of rubber bands. Oh, we have to see that. Like
Yeah.
we stopped for that. So all the weird stuff we stopped for. And then I went to LA. I saw all the points in LA. I wanted to see all the Jim Morrison sites and Frank Zappa's house and all that stuff. And then we drove up the coast because I wanted to stop at Big Sur. I wanted to see Henry Miller's house, which is now a museum, and I wanted to see the cabin that Kerouac wrote Big Sur in,
Mm.
Ferlinghetti's cabin, both of which I found. And I wanted to see Big Sur. So we spent a week in Big Sur. And then driving north to Berkeley, of course, you go through Santa Cruz. And if you know that area in down around Big Sur, there's no gas stations to speak of
Hmm.
except maybe one, the Big Sur Cafe gas station, which is like if gas was $1.50 a gallon everywhere else, it was $5 a gallon there,
Right.
and we're like, no, we're not going to get gas there. So I saw Santa Cruz, and I'm like, let's get gas here and coffee and maybe get some food, and that was it. That's why we stopped on our way to
Nice.
Berkeley.
Nice. And then from there, you developed a bit of a relationship with Bob, huh? You were chauffeuring him around and
Yeah, so I didn't know he didn't drive. Um, I mean, Arlen and him had I think it was a red Volvo station wagon, and they were in that apartment. Did you ever go up there and see him?
no,
Okay,
I'm
so they
not
were in
familiar.
apartment. I want to say it was like the kind of the border of Capitola in Santa Cruz or SoCal in Santa Cruz ish. But he was kind of like not in Santa Cruz downtown proper. It was kind of like suburb Santa Cruz. But that area, Santa Cruz, Capitola, SoCal, Watsonville, even a little bit. It's like a metropolis of little cities that border each other. So you can literally be walking down the street and all of a sudden you're in SoCal. Oh, when did that happen? Like
Hmm.
boom. So they moved. They were out there, and they had a red Volvo station wagon, and then Nina Graboy, who was the lady that was living downstairs from me. So if you look her up, she's a great psychedelic. Um,
Yeah.
Everything. She knew everybody. It was incredible. I met everybody through her. She introduced me to the entire community. Allen Ginsberg, like all these people she was introducing me to, and I was just like astounded, like, that person? Like, she knew everybody. John Lilly, it's like there wasn't anybody in the psychedelic circle that she didn't know. So I drove her around. She wrote a book called One Foot in the Future, and then she was doing some appearances, and she didn't like to drive because she had bad eyesight. So I drove her all over, and you know, I got to hang out, meet cool people, hang out at cool places, and help my friend. And she mentioned to Arlen that that I drove her around, and Arlen's like, "Oh, maybe you could drive Bob around." So they kind of like I got introduced to Bob, like as a driver, and he liked the way I drive because he was a little nervous as a passenger sometimes, um, and um, and he didn't drive. And I asked him. I found out later why he didn't drive, but at the time I didn't know. And I said, why do you have a car and you don't drive? And he said, his answer to me was Salvador Dali didn't drive. I'm like, okay, that's a good answer. That's a Bob answer. Um, so I drove him around whenever he made appearances within, I'd say, 100 or so miles of Santa Cruz, I would drive him, and then anything other than that, I think he would get a plane ticket or something like that. So we
And
spent a lot of time in the car, which was cool. And this is what right at the time when Reality is What You Can Get Away With came out. So I knew some friends who made kind of guerrilla movies,
hmm.
VHS at the time, direct to VHS. And so I introduced them, and they talked about doing something, and then Al Zuckerman got involved, and you know, they didn't. Al thought he was dealing with Hollywood people. I think he was like, we need a $30,000 retainer or something, and they're like, nah, we don't. That's not how we do this. Like we're just guerrilla filmmakers. I'm like, okay, well, it's cool. We tried, and we got to talk a lot about that book, that script. And we talked about a lot of things, but we talked about that book specifically because it had just come out when I started driving around. So it was a subject. I had just read it. I had questions. Bob and I found out we both loved Ed Wood, and so we talked a lot of Ed Wood films. Because I was really into the whole psychotronic film thing from Chicago, and I loved the Golden Turkey Awards, and so we had a lot of bad movie conversations. Um, and in a lot of ways, that book is an homage to bad movies
Ah.
and good movies too. But there's a lot of campy movies that he references in that book, and I didn't know it until like we started talking about it. But we shared a love for bad movies.
I don't remember when I read Reality is What You Can Get Away With, but I remember reading it probably here in the Tattered Cover bookstore in Denver. And it really I didn't want to read it again for this because it had such an impact on me when I read it
Hmm.
15 years ago. It really blew my mind, and I didn't want to spoil
Hmm.
whatever it had, but I just remember kind of it being the oddest thing in the world that just turned my mind inside out.
Hmm.
And I guess that kind of brings into something I heard you discuss about the relationship between theater and ritual and gaming.
Hmm.
And to the extent that this is a screenplay or theater,
Hmm.
and and to me, in an intention, well, all writing, maybe particularly Bob's writing, is a magical act.
Oh yeah.
But I'm wondering if you had something to say about all that.
I think that Bob had more effect on me as a writer from that perspective than anybody I read. Maybe because I also knew him, so it probably had a stronger connection for me. But also like reality is what you can get away with has always been my favorite work of his
Hmm.
because I think for whatever reason, and I've written movie treatments, and I understand that like something happens to you when you're writing a movie treatment or a script where if you're inclined to like Dada surrealist type thinking, like I am and like Bob was, it kind of unlocks that for you, and you let it, you kind of like let it go and run with it because you're thinking in movie think when you're writing this. You're not thinking in book think. You're not thinking like,
Hmm.
when you write a book, you're thinking like, and the person that reads this is going to think this, right? And so when you write, you're thinking movie, like this is what they're going to see, this is what they're going to hear, this is what they're going to feel. So you've got added dimensions that you're putting into this work, and so you're speaking to theater, right? You're thinking theater when you're writing this, and so you're speaking to theater, and you're speaking in theater language. So when you're writing a book, you can't think about things like the sound, the color, the pacing. Like these are not things as you're thinking as much in book as you are definitely thinking in theater, and so you're thinking in film. It's like these are all things that are added dimensions which add to the color makeup of your palette when you're writing. It's like you have more to work with. And so a good example is like the last thing that I wrote, which was the third part of a trilogy. I called it the Mind Movie because I wrote it as
Hmm.
thinking like it was going to be made into a film someday. I don't think it is. It's not my plan. But I wanted to write it as if like this is going to be. It's really a graphic novel, but you can get theatrical graphic novels too. And I wanted to be thinking about like if this was a movie, how would I write it so that average person reading it, not a filmmaker, but an average person on the street reading this would get the feeling that I'm feeling when I write it. Can you think about the sound that this would make? Can you feel the rain on your head? Those kind of things.
Hmm.
And so I tried to invoke that as I wrote it. And when I read reality is what you can get away with. And when they offered me at Hilarious, they said, "What book do you want to write the forward to?" I picked that, and I said, "I understand because of the rights. It's going to be tricky because it was a tricky when he wrote the book. It was very tricky for that." For that alone. When we looked into making it into a movie, I found out how tricky it was going to be to make into a movie because the rights it's like he references everything that's probably ever been made in film, in the early days. And so you're going to have to find out if that's available. And then if it is, you're going to find out who owns the rights and those things, how these things go. It's like they get sold and they get sold and then people die and then the estate goes into who knows what and everything's in stasis. Um, and so I was thinking about that, and I'm like, that's probably going to be one of the last books that Hilarious is going to be able to publish. But that's okay because I have an emotional connection to that book because I remember those hours in a car with Bob driving
Hmm.
around and talking about that book right after it was published, and then on top of it, doing all the research to see if we could make it into a video and finding out like everything that I do like well the estate that owned this movie doesn't own it anymore and they're not really sure who owns the rights which is weird but that's the case for a lot of old movies and if you think that you can just go ahead and make it you're wrong because there will be somebody who pops up and files a lawsuit if you just go ahead and make it right because there's all these copyright trolls, lawyers that like swirl around Hollywood just looking for something like that, and they're hoping that you'll settle to get them off your back.
Right.
Yeah. So I knew there was a lot of weird things that were going to go on with the making of that book, but I knew it would be eventually get made.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that was exactly right. Apparently, when the book was written, it wasn't too expensive to purchase the rights to those
right,
photos. It's a bunch of
right,
photos from old movies.
right, right.
But when they looked into it in modern times here, the last few years, it was owned by a lot of the images were owned by Getty Images,
Yep,
or which
yep,
are is just has an army of lawyers that I know
yep.
too well about from personal experience. But he had edited himself or other things
Right.
into many of the
Yeah.
photos, and apparently that voids the copyright. So then, or the rights, or whatever it is, and
Right.
then Rasa just basically had to take the photos that didn't have some editing done and
Right.
throw in Olga the ostrich, or Bob,
Right.
or Bob from the
Bob
Subgenius, and
Dobbs. Yeah.
Bob Dobbs, and that took care of it. So it's finally, I think you're right. It is like the last book on the docket to be released here.
Yeah. I figured it would be because, like I said, because I was intimately, you know, I was involved in looking at making it into a movie at one point, which got me into a depth of knowledge about the book and the contents of the book as far as rights. And so I kind of looked at it and I'm like, yeah, it's even harder now than it was back then because that was like what, 91, 92,
That
somewhere around
sounds
there.
right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think.
Um, and so we probably we could have got away with more back then than we could now for sure. Because that was before the advent of the internet, in popular culture at least, um, and the whole thing of a lot of those movies, like if you've ever done the research for that kind of thing, you find out like who owns the rights to something. Well, the director, probably has, or the director or the producers have the rights to something, but they're dead, and so their estate inherited that, and maybe
Hmm.
one of the estates sold a part of their holding, but the other states didn't sell, and then those people are dead by now, and it's like a lot of things are just sitting in a vacuum, waiting for somebody to try to do something with it. That's really what it's about. And in a couple projects in Hollywood, when I lived in LA working in the film industry, I got involved in a couple projects similar to that, and I found out about these lawyers that will just show up out of nowhere and make claims, and they have no way to prove that they really have a claim, but then they'll tie you up in court. And what
Right.
they're hoping for is that you'll just pay them off and make them go away.
Yeah, I think that's Getty Images' business model as well.
Probably. And there's lawyers that actually exist on that model. Like that's their whole
Reason
way
for
of living. Yeah.
yeah, patent rights is probably the same thing.
Parasites.
Yeah, exactly. And so I did crack it open and thumb around, and the immediate thing that struck me was that it is just there's like jump cuts everywhere,
Yep.
like multiple per page.
Yep.
And I'm not a movie historian, but that's kind of a common thing today to make a fast-paced movie with full of jump cuts. But
Yeah.
back in '91, that seems like it was kind of an oddity.
There was only probably one group of people doing stuff like that at that time. And that was Liquid Television people that were working with MTV. This
Hmm.
is where the patented, not really patented, but in quotes, patented method that MTV used called the blendo, which was just jump cut, jump cut, jump cut, jump cut. If you remember back then, and that was really where that started, where that came from. Just do these jump cuts, really fast paced jump cuts, and usually syncopated to music. And MTV was probably the only outlet doing something like that at that point, and that was still like really new because that was like about the time that Ren and Stimpy showed up for the first time, and all that stuff was brand new. I mean, this stuff now is like ancient to us, but like at the time, this was what everybody was talking about because I was, you know, hanging around with a lot of video people at the time, and we had just got our hands on the New Tech video toaster. Um, and Todd Rundgren had done a video with it, and so it was like this whole thing of being able to do jump cuts and Blendo as they call it, became something that you didn't need a multi-million-dollar studio to do anymore. Basically, you
Right.
could have an Amiga computer and a New Tech video toaster slave to it, and a video deck. Even like it hadn't got as far as like now where you can just on your edit this stuff on your Mac and it
Right.
looks like it was done in a studio. But for a couple $1,000s, you could do what used to be, what only something that only a studio like a multi-million-dollar studio could do for a couple $1,000s. A couple $1,000s in 91 was still a lot of money to a lot of us, but we could pool our money together or we could even like groups of people could buy it and rent it, or like but you could get your hands on the technology. It wasn't out of your grasp anymore, and so people started to do interesting things with video. Michael Nesmith from the Monkees had done some really cool things. Like he was really the guy that saw the vision. Like home video is going to be something that's going to be a market, and so he came out with this thing called Elephant Parts, and it was like weird Blendo type uh, video stuff. It was like like kind of like Kentucky Fried Movie. It was all these little skits kind of patched together into a movie, um, but it was kind of a little more sophisticated than that. So he was doing what he was doing. Bob was seeing that obviously, and he just come out of L.A. So when you live in L.A., through osmosis, you get you know doesn't matter if you're in the industry or not. You get part of it. You absorb part of it. You sit at the cafe and you hear people talk about movies that are working in the film industry. So all this stuff kind of like floats around, and then you're in it. You're in the soup, and so you absorb it one way or another. And I think he had absorbed a lot of that being in L.A. And I think at that time one of the many times that there was talk of making Lemonatus into a movie. Like, I don't know how many times that thing's been optioned,
Right.
but it's, a million probably. Even when I was in LA, there were people coming up to me and talking about optioning Illuminatus, and I'm like, talk to the family. um, and I hear still recently, I just heard that there's an option for I think a TV series for Illuminatus.
Yeah, I've heard rumblings, but I couldn't
Yeah,
speak to it.
yeah,
It seemed like that was one of Bob's things, is at least probably from his LA days, I assume, where he really wanted to get a movie
yeah.
going with something.
Well, he wanted to direct. Well, like when we talked about doing reality is what you can get away with as a video, he said, if this happens, I want to be the director because I know
Hmm.
he wanted. Because he told me, like, I really want to direct this thing because I read it and I came to him. I'm like, dude, this would be a movie. Like, this is really you really mean this is a movie, right? Not just an exercise. He's like, yeah, I want to direct it. In fact, I'm like, good on you. I'll help. I'll anything I can do to help. Um, and even if it didn't get made into a movie, it gave me inspiration. And the recent trilogy I just talked about that I wrote the first part as a movie treatment, the first book, and then it floated around Hollywood and got optioned or almost optioned, and then and then I just like, you know what, I'm just going to publish it as a book. Same thing Bob did. He wrote Reality is What You Can Get Away With. I think he wrote it to shop it as a treatment, and he shopped it around, and then he kind of like me, like everybody's always gonna, and but nobody ever like follows through on anything usually. So like me, he was like, yeah, I'll just publish it as a book, and then if it gets made later, fine, but at least somebody gets to read this thing. And I did the same thing. Like, and I was inspired by Bob. I wrote the treatment. I went to 5 million meetings with people. Everybody was dropping big names at me, but nobody was coming up with any money in a contract. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to publish it as a book because, Bob did that with Realities of What You Can Get Away With. I remember I was involved in all that. And then, when Hilaritas came and said, pick a book, and I saw that one, I'm like, oh, I don't even have to think about it. That one, because I've got experience with that. That's why I wrote the first book in my trilogy as a treatment. because if I didn't get it made as a movie, at least I would get it, published it as a book as a treatment. And Bob really showed me that you can do that and get away with it. A lot of people
Nice.
probably would have said, "Oh, this is a movie treatment, rewrite it as a novel," but he didn't.
Right.
He published it as a treatment, as a script, because Bob, like me, doesn't underestimate his readers. He's like, no,
Hmm.
they will get this. They will read this as a movie script, and they will have the visuals that I had when I was thinking about this as a movie, right? That's the better way to do it. If you're thinking about something as a movie and you write it down, you hand it to the next person as a script or a treatment, you're talking about the visuals in a way that you probably wouldn't describe them in a book.
Right. It's a totally different context in
Yeah,
a way.
yeah. It's a completely different context. It's a different medium.
Yeah. And
So I call it a mind movie, which is these things that you publish as a printed treatment or script that's really a movie that didn't get made. So you let the reader make the movie in their mind
Hmm.
by reading.
Right. And he had another one right where you were sitting right now, I believe it was called.
Wilhelm Reich in Hell too.
Oh, that's right. Jeez.
Yeah, that was I think a play.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
wrote that as a stage play.
and that actually got produced
Yeah, and that got
eventually.
produced. Yeah.
And it seems like we're not there yet, as far as I know, but we're so close to being able to just feed this book into an AI and it'll should spit out a movie.
Oh, it probably would now. Um, I'm gonna give away my thinking here. I hope not. I
Hmm.
hope that doesn't happen with that. I
With
hope
this
that
this particular book.
yeah, I hope it gets made as a movie with human beings.
Ah,
Or at the very least, I hope it happens as a stage play, like they did with Wilhelm Reich, like Daisy Campbell, I think was involved in that.
right.
Um, yeah, I saw the video of that. That was amazing. Um, in fact, they did an audio book release of chapters from Cosmic Trigger, and it was something they produced to go along with that play. And I actually read one of the chapters for that, but it was like this multimedia, interdisciplinary thing that they did, which was cool. I think that before if it comes down to, like, if somebody said to me the only way this is ever gonna get made into a movie is if it gets fed into an AI, I'd be like, okay, fine, then it will. That's what happens. But I'd like to see it happen with human beings because you know theater is magic,
Right.
and I want humans involved in my magic. Right now, don't get me wrong, I've used AI in magic. So I did some magical things with AI back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and got some interesting results. But if I was doing something like a play, or a movie, and it was a magical working, I'd like human beings involved.
I
Yeah,
get where you're coming from
yeah.
now to the point that, I mean, you're just, there's a whole different energy when you've got human beings invoking their characters and, yeah.
Oh yeah, because you've got the human being. Well, as somebody who does acting sometimes, um, I'm a method actor, and method acting is something I learned through magic, not the other way around. Um, the guy who taught all the people at Second City, Del Close, was a Golden Dawn magician who used talismata as a way to teach the actors in Second City of how to embody their character.
Hmm.
He was an actual Golden Dawn magician. If you look at paintings of him, like the Del Close Theater in L.A. on Hollywood Boulevard, it used to be there. It might still be there. Um, you see paintings of him. He's wearing, a ring with a pentagram on it, and you know he, but he was using magic ritual methods to teach the actors, but he didn't tell the actors that's what he was doing because he didn't want to put them off. Because some people hear magic and they go like,
Yeah.
they freak out.
A
Um,
cult.
but he was using Golden Dawn techniques to teach improv, and to teach theater and to teach method acting. And so I got into method acting as a tool to use in my ritual. And then I fell in love with method acting. And then method acting became a tool that I used in my writing. So it went from magic to method acting to writing, all three. And that was the path. So I studied method acting to be a better magician. And then I used it. I used method acting and ritual to be a better writer.
That this seems like an important point, or it's just something I've not heard much about, the connection between magic and movies and acting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is there more to it than that? I mean, is that a
Yeah, there's a
common
lot
thing?
more to it. I don't want to fall down that trail on you, but because it's a personal passion of mine. But
That's
think of it
okay.
think of it this way: when you're a method actor, the whole thing is get yourself out of the way and make room for the character to embody you. And if you do it correctly, you become the character. Quite literally, you become the character, right? So
Right.
if you've never had that experience, that sounds like crazy talk,
Well, yeah.
right? But if you've had the experience, you like it clicks and you're like, oh, I when it happens, finally happens for you, you're like, oh, I get it. Oh, I get it. So I'll use an example. Is when I first started studying magic, I was studying the Golden Dawn method, and I would do like everybody else. I like learned everything about the angels, and I learned everything about the elements, and I learned everything like all these things you learn. Planetary correspondence. You learn your Hebrew, you learn the numbers, you learn your gematria, you learn all these things, and you're taking all this in. You're doing this ritual, and you're like, you know, oh, what do I do now? I do this, and then what do I do now? I do this, and what do I think now? I think that, and you keep doing that and doing that and doing that until it becomes muscle memory. And at one point, it did for me. Like I went through a ritual, I didn't have to think about what I was going to do. My mind was completely open to be thinking telesmotically. I was projecting like right now I see in front of me an angel. The angel has these aspects. The angel embodies this element, and then I moved through the whole thing. And then when I did it the first time and didn't have to think about it, meaning myself was out of the way finally, that's when I felt a real effect of the ritual. And I said, oh my God, it worked. That worked. Up until then, I was just learning the muscle memory. I was learning the things that I had to be keeping in my mind when I was facing east, when I was making these symbols, what was I seeing in my mind? Like all these things, I didn't have to think about it anymore. They just clicked, doom, 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 when they happened. And when it did, I had this ecstatic experience.
Hmm.
I felt a tingle in the base of my spine, ran up the back of my spine, and then cracked like a static crack and saw like a lightning flash crack.
Wow.
And I went, "Oh, that's what's supposed to happen." you know?
It's like, yeah.
Oh, because I was making it was almost like going to the gym. I was getting up every morning going, "Okay, I got to do this thing. Got to remember to do this thing every morning, no matter what. I got to do this thing." And I was starting to like, "Why am I doing this? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, if this is what it's about, I'm ready to quit. And it's like when you go to the gym every day, and you do this, oh my God, you do this thing. And then one day suddenly you realize that the 3 sets of 10 reps aren't as hard to do. Like, oh, wait, I got through that and I didn't have to struggle. Cool. And then you look down at your muscle and you're like, oh, my biceps grown a bit. Oh, that's why I'm doing this. And then you become more exuberant and you kind of find your second breath, your second wind. You're like, okay, that's why I'm doing this. There are results that can be gained, and let's try to get more results. So that happened to me with magic. And so when I started studying um, acting, method acting, I would go through the ritual, go through the motions, go through all this stuff, and I kind of like had to like get down like the role, find out everything I could about the person. If the author hadn't really done a profile of the character that I was playing, I had to write my own profile. I'm like, okay, this
Mm.
guy came from a bad background. He probably went through these kind of things. His parents were probably this, as I constructed a backstory for myself. And then I began to like take that on and take that on. And so as you do that, you're getting out of the way of yourself. You're making room for this character and you're kind of moving your ego out of the way for a moment. Like it's like meditation. Get your ego out of the way. And so when I had a success with that, I said, the next time I want to do this, I want to do this with writing. And so
Mm.
when I started writing my trilogy, um, it was in a place. I was in a place that was good. I'd gone to the North Pole in 2017. I spent most of 2017 in Alaska and the Arctic Circle, and it's not easy to live up there. Um, and I was doing things that were not easy to do. So I spent the first
Mm.
couple of months working the salmon fishing industry. Not easy.
That's no joke.
It's no joke, man. That's like 7 days a week, 16 to 18 hours a day shifts until the season is over. No time off until all the fish are had. And Fish and Game tells them when to stop fishing. They're like, okay, you've reached the limit, stop fishing, and then that's when the season's over. You don't know going in if you're going to be there 2 weeks or 3 months, and I was there for like almost 4 months. And then while when that was over, I took about a day or two off to kind of recover, and then I was thinking about going back to the lower 48, and I was in a bar in Naknek, Alaska, which is this tiny little fishing village on a river where the sockeye salmon run.
Mm.
There's no roads in or out of that town. There's a boat once every week, and there's an airplane. And the only way in and out. You're so far up in the wilderness in Alaska, there are no external roads that go anywhere because there's nowhere to go. Right?
Right.
You go way out in the middle of nowhere. And I met these guys at the bar that were Japanese, and we kind of hit it off, and we were eating pizza and drinking beer. And they said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, back home I do computers and IT, but up here I just wanted to, get back to like being in my body for a while, so I did this." And they said, "Oh, you do IT?" I'm like, "Yeah." "You know satellites?" "Oh, yeah, I know satellites." "Okay, we have a boat, and we're doing a expedition up to the Arctic Circle to study methane release. And so we need somebody who can run the IT on the ship and then contact the satellite once a day to squirt up the data, squirt the bird, they call it, but squirt the data up." And I said, "Oh, I can do that. Here's my real resume." And they called me like the next day and they said, "Don't leave. Get on the boat with us. Come to Alaska." Come to Arctic Circle. And I'm like, okay. So I spent the rest of 2017 on this boat with them up in the Arctic Circle, and had like the most fantastic experience of my life. Really changed my life. Like really did things to my consciousness. I was up there during dark time, some of it, which
Mm.
is interesting because you wake up and it's dark, you go to bed and it's dark. It's like
Yeah.
there's no light ever. I was working still working 16-hour days, but what it wasn't as physically demanding, as the salmon
Mm.
was. I was playing with wires and radios and stuff like that. So yeah, I wasn't beating my body up, but I was staying up long hours and seeing weird things in the Arctic Circle, and I actually saw the data. So for the first time in my life, I saw it was up close and personal. Like up until then, climate change had always been this abstract notion,
Right.
but I was seeing like the scientists were showing me like, see that thing on shore? where those 4 foot trees are, yeah, that's supposed to be permafrost. It hasn't been permafrost for several years. It's long enough that those trees grew. They're like 4 or 5 feet tall. I'm like, oh. And then I'm looking at this methane release. I'm like, oh. I'm like, this shit is real.
Oh.
This is real. Like it's in my face. I can't deny it. It's not an abstract concept. It's right here in front of me. It's real. This is really happening to the planet. And so after months of that, I came back and went to LA. A friend of mine who's an actor was she was in South Africa, and she's got this house right on the beach right there in Pacific Palisades. And she said, house sit my cottage for me, and kind of come back to earth. And, so I did. And then all of a sudden, after about a week or two of like kind of coming back into my body a little bit, I started typing, looking out the window and typing. And I didn't know what I was writing. I was just writing.
Hmm.
And it was this character for the book, or, for the movie. This character was telling his story to me, and I was writing it down. So a friend of mine was watching this on Google Docs because he was going to be my editor, and he's watching me write. He's like, one night he's like, when you're writing in Google Docs, yeah. He's like, I'm watching you. I'm like, yeah, I see you log in. It's okay. Doesn't matter. He's like, well, the question is, did you longhand this when you were up north, and then you're transcribing this? I'm like, no. He's like, because you don't stop. You don't back up. You just like writing it like you're taking dictation. Like, because that's what I'm doing, dude. This guy's in my head telling me the story, and I'm trying to get it down as fast as I can so we can get on to the next thing. And then he's like, wait, so he's a real character in your head? I'm like, yeah, yeah, this happens. It just happened automatically. I didn't sit down and go, I'm going to use method acting to write this book. It just happened. I was so tired. I was
Ah.
so exhausted from that whole trip, and just physically exhausted and emotionally drained for seeing what I saw about, about the things that were happening with the planet, and the climate, and the animals that I was seeing up there, and aurora borealis and nighttime all the time. It's like all this stuff like crushed me in this big emotional ball, and then all of a sudden I was like, I just gotta write, just gotta write. This thing's got to come out, whatever it is, it's got to come out. And so I was totally out of the way, and I didn't have to sit down and meditate for 5 days, and I didn't have to starve myself or do weird yogic, postures. It was just the right place at the right time, and I was in the right spot, and it just like all came out. And I literally wrote this thing in 2 weeks.
Wow.
Just came out of me. And then, I said, oh, this story's got more than one piece. I think I have to write a trilogy, at least. And so it just kept coming out over the years. But the first part was, I don't think if I hadn't have been so trained as a method actor, and as a person who meditates, and as a magician, to get myself out of the way. If I didn't know how to do that, instinctively know how to do that, it probably wouldn't have happened the way it did, but it did because of the fact that I was prepped. I was ready
Right.
for it.
Wow.
Because, like, what they say in voodoo, you let the spirit ride you,
Ah.
right?
Right.
And so it did feel like, in a positive way, it felt like a possession. Like Cameron, the person who was writing this, telling me this story, was, like, was there. He was like in my head telling me this story, and I didn't try to rationalize that. I didn't say, "Are you having a nervous breakdown?" or any of these things to myself. I just said, "Write it down." And as soon as I wrote it down, I felt a million times better, and it was gone. It was over. It just wanted to come out.
And if I'm following all this, I think I am, there's something about the exhaustion, but there's also something about that time in what I'll call the wilderness, I guess, the
That
Arctic.
too.
And And was there a certain amount of receptivity that had to be cultivated, or is that?
Well, I think the fact that I started doing ritual magic when I was really young,
Mm-hmm.
and then I got into method acting. So those two things probably prepped me.
Right.
And then when it happened in 2017 that this story wanted to be told, I can I think my mind automatically constructed it in a way that the character would tell me the story. So it wasn't alien to me to do this. Like, this was already a muscle memory.
You'd had the reps in.
I'd had the reps in. So it just said a story has to be told now, and we're going to do it. We're going to use these methods you already know. Here we go. This should not freak you out because you've already done this, right? And it didn't. I just kind of relaxed and went, okay, this is what we're doing, and I just went with it. Whereas other people might have had a crisis if they started hearing a voice in their head telling them a story. A
Mm.
lot of people might have freaked the f out, like,
Right,
and
right.
I probably would have too if I didn't have that prep. If I didn't go, oh, this is yeah, I know this one, you know, like most people don't have that experience. So after I came back, after I wrote that story, and before I wrote the second story in the trilogy, I discovered Martin Shaw. And I discovered Martin Shaw through my friend John, John Harrigan, who heads up the theater group called the Foolish People. So they're like they do ritual magic theater and movies. And so their whole theater thing is based around ritual. All the stuff we were just talking about, John, I call John my brother from another mother. Like we met years ago and we know so like we do the same things the same way. And so all the stuff I just told you, he would just be going, uh-huh, yeah, well, of course, yeah. Like he's like me. He's like he's ready for that thing that happened. And so he was, when it happened to him, he was ready. What happened to me, I was ready. Um, so he introduced me to Martin Shaw, who's this mythologist that lives in Devon, who takes people into the wilderness and does this thing called 4-day vigil to get them to, meet the land and talk to the spirits of the land and all these things. So I read his stuff and I'm like, oh, well, of course, that's what just happened to me. I just did that, but I didn't know that, like I never read a book about what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. And he says the same thing, like ritual magic, theater, like all these things are the precursors to having that ecstatic moment. And so John knows it. John's had it. John recognized it in Martin, handed Martin off to me. I recognized it in Martin. I'm like, okay. So I started doing wilderness visuals because it's the thing I'm doing now. Not, it's magic, it's theater, it's wilderness, which I did unconsciously in the Arctic Circle and in Alaska, but I didn't know that's what I was doing. I didn't set out with a plan, but it just happened. Again, I didn't move to California to meet these people in Santa Cruz, but I did, you know, because somehow I got myself out of the way. I think that the California connection happened because, and you've probably heard this. I had a Valis episode, haven't we all, right? Or no, you've never heard of this?
I don't
People,
know.
okay, people get into Valis. So this was the 80s, and at that time Valis was no longer in print. So I had to scour used bookstores across Chicago looking for this at the time like really obscure book. Like most people didn't know what I was talking about. I'm like, no, Philip K. Dick had this weird experience and he wrote this trilogy. Like everybody's like, what? It's like Philip K. Dick, doesn't he write pulp stuff? And so I finally found Valis and a couple of other things that had just been written. And I made contact with some people who turned me on to the exegesis, which hadn't been republished yet. In fact, I think it was Jay Kinney and his friends had the copy. It was like I heard it was a filing cabinet full of paper, the original exegesis.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a monster from what I
yeah, it was like
understand.
millions of pages. Um, So there was a couple of things that had come out, obscure things that had come out about the exegesis. So anyway, you fall down this rabbit hole of chasing Valis, and I was in that mode. I was in chasing Valis mode when I moved to California. So I was kind of enough out of the way, out of my own way, that like it was in the zone, as I say to people, like, and the zone. Like if you're an athlete, you definitely know the zone.
Yeah.
If you're an artist, you know the zone. You definitely know the zone. So I was in the zone. That's what allowed me to be, you know, absent enough from in my ego to let something else take over and find the others, find the place to be. The thing that would change my life like the most ever was moving to Santa Cruz at that time. And it was never a plan. Again, going to Alaska and going to the Arctic wasn't a plan. That happened surreptitiously in a bar in Naknek. And then I came back and I didn't have a plan to write a book, but I did because that it was time to do that. That's what happened.
And it sounds like you weren't necessarily seeking something. You were
Nope.
just, it just kind of fell into your lap, so to speak.
I was open enough probably that it could.
Right. You were cracked open.
I was cracked open. So yeah, so that's what I was saying. Like I know some people that have had experiences like mine that weren't ready for it, and it caused panic. It caused them to panic, and if you panic, it's over. You're done. You need to like you have to recover from that and start over. Like
It,
you can't panic.
yeah. And it seems like, well, call it the last several years or so, we've had a lot of people getting cracked open
Yep.
without the tools or the wherewithal to support themselves.
Well, I've heard some people describe it as people being put into shamanic circumstances without having the prep.
Right.
And so you have a failed shamanic experience. You know, that's probably one of the worst things that can happen to you
Yeah.
because you're resisting at every moment. You don't know what's happening to you. You're making conclusions that probably aren't the correct conclusions, but you're making the conclusions that you've been socially trained to make. I hear voices in my head. I'm crazy. I'm going to end up
Right.
in an institution. I need medication. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to be socially ostracized. I'm going to be end up homeless. I'm going to, all these things are going to like rush to your mind, and that's not going to help.
Yeah. I forget the quote, and I'm barely can put it together, but basically somebody was touring a mental health institution and was like, "This is the way your culture treats the future shamans."
Yeah.
And like,
Well, because they are, but there was no social construct that was set up to help them, to aid them, and so you have a failed initiation. And can you think of
ah,
anything worse than a failed initiation? It's like,
right.
I hesitate to call them students. I have people that follow me into the wilderness. Let's put it that way. And we have experiences together. And I'm older. I'm 62 now. And so some of these people are younger and they look to me to interpret for them because I've probably gone through what they've gone through for the first time. I've probably done three. So I try to explain it to them. I was like, you're doing something that's very specialized, and you have to understand that not everybody can be the shaman
Mm,
because if everybody in the tribe was the shaman, everybody would starve because everybody'd be sitting around trying to have the experience, in the hills when you should have been hunting and planting and gathering. So usually it was one or two people that were picked to do that for the whole tribe. It's like not everybody was a shaman. So that's the first thing. You have to know that it's a very specialized thing that you've been called to do. and you're not even sure that you've been called to do it. So this is a tryout for you. Like, is this really what you want? Or do you want to have an experience and then realize that, you just want to be a better person? That's cool. Like we all need to be better people. So like have moments that will make you realize that you can and should be a better person and strive for that. And that's cool. Occasionally you get that one person who's got this ability that other people don't have, like to hear voices or to, you know, interpret the weather, know when the weather's going to change, or know that this herd of bison is going to be coming by tomorrow. You might want to take advantage of that, or there's water over there underground. You don't see it, but I can feel it. So I'm going to tell you, like, dig right there. There'll probably be some water, all kinds of things. This is a very specialized skill and it has to be honed like any other skill. So you keep working that muscle until it becomes muscle memory.
What is it about the wilderness, being out in
Well,
nature?
modernity gets shut down in the wilderness for one
Mm,
thing. Like you to really do it the right way, you have to go so far out that you don't see the glow of civilization,
mm,
right? You don't hear it. You don't hear cars. You don't hear people yelling at each other. You don't hear people blasting music. You don't hear, jackhammers. Like this stuff goes away, right? And when that happens, if you've done that before and you do it long enough, at first you like notice the miss you miss it. You kind of like, well, there's something missing. Like I even know people I've taken into the wilderness, they couldn't sleep for the first night because there wasn't enough light and sound. Because they're so used to being surrounded by buzzing and flicking and clicking and light and all these things that happen. They don't know how to sleep without it.
mm,
So that's the first thing you have to decompress.
yeah.
And then when you get there, then you have to listen to the silence because the silence is where the most things are said. It's
Mm,
like people ask me, can you put it very simply for me? What do I need to do? And I grew up in Chicago, so I'm a little rougher than a lot of people. I said, just go out into the wilderness and shut the fuck up and do it until you hear something. Well, if I shut the fuck up, what am I going to hear? You're going to hear the land speaking to you, stupid. And like, that's where you want to be. You're trying to get to that spot where you can hear the land speaking to you, not yourself,
mm,
not what people said to you yesterday, not that you're angry at your girlfriend or your boyfriend or you're mad at your boss or none of that. Like you have to, that's why you sit vigil for 4 days with no food and no shelter. Like you take a tarp and a gallon of water and you go out there and you sit. Of course, most of these people don't know that I'm observing them from a distance because I don't want to kill anybody, but but they don't know that, right? So when I first started doing this in the desert, I took groups of people out to teach them how to work together. And they didn't know I was observing them, but I was observing them. And then, usually there would be a point where it would go Lord of the Flies and I'd come get them, and I'd go, oh, look, all your water and food is gone. Wonder why that is. You're all hating each other. Wonder why that is. Yeah, let's go back and talk about this. How did this happen? Like, you guys came out here together and I left you in, as far as I left you, 40 miles from
ah,
anything and anybody. And you were really reliant on each other for survival and you weren't capable of doing it. So why was that? That's a good thing for a lot of people to
oh
learn.
yeah.
Yeah.
Probably scares the
So
shit out of a lot of people
yeah,
too.
it does scare the shit out of it. But some people get something out of it. So um, one group was a team, was actually a software team that was not able to ship the software. They were like completely disabled and broken down and dysfunctional. And so I waited till they like broke completely down in the wilderness, and then I came and got them because I was watching them the whole time. And I came and got them with the horses, and I took them back to camp. And I said, what happened? And then everybody was like, "Oh, he ate all the food. He drank all the water. He wouldn't cut firewood." It's like everybody was pointing at everybody else.
Hmm.
And I said, "Let me show you a picture." And I put a picture of a tree up on the wall. And I said, "See this tree? This tree doesn't have to read a self-help book to know how to survive in the wilderness. You're dumber than this tree. This tree knows what it's doing. This tree it's not blaming the other trees. This tree is working with the fungus and the other trees to the roots and the soil and the bugs and the microbes and the air and everything it's working with to survive. Everything's working in harmony to survive. And it's not blaming everybody else for why it's not. If it's not surviving, it's not blaming everybody else. And usually it's surviving because it's not blaming everybody else."
Great metaphor for getting people out of their victim complex.
Yeah, exactly. So these are the kinds of things that I try to teach these days. And when I take people into the wilderness, these are the things that I tell them. Like, listen, it's like the second book in the trilogy is about a guy doing a wilderness vigil, and he has like a very, phenomenal experience, we'll say. Um, and one of the things that happens to him when he's sitting in the wilderness, which I extrapolated off of a real wilderness vigil that I did in Big Sur, and then of course I spiced it up a bit, and I had a lot of raccoons that were very interested in who I am and why I'm in their forest, and so they used to come visit me. And in the book, the raccoons that come visit this guy eventually start talking to him in voices, like he can hear them speaking.
Hmm.
And he said, why are you here? Why do you know I'm here?" And one raccoon says, "Well, I was eating a tree root across the forest over there, and it told me that you're over here. So I thought I'd come by and see what's going on." Because it's all connected. If you know anything about tree roots and the mushroom cultures that live under the tree roots, everything's working together. There's all this communication going on under your feet.
Right.
All these trees and mushrooms are all talking to each other all the time. So there's this whole network of like if you're a network person, there's a whole network beneath your feet that if you'll just shut up and listen, you can probably tap into it. But you got to get out there and like get away and listen.
Yeah. It's a completely different mindset in a way. Mindset might not even be the right word, but
Yeah,
state of being. Completely
it's a
different
state
state
of being.
of being.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you get to the right place, you realize you're part of that network as well.
Right.
So you're not really listening in on the network. You're just receptive. You're becoming a receptive node in that network. And now you're part of the network. And of course you can hear it because you're part of it.
Yeah, that word receptivity seems so key in what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And getting yourself out of the way.
Get yourself out of the way.
Yeah.
And I
So,
think that bringing it back to Bob,
yeah.
um, as a young man, um, the person that put me in touch with the things that led me down this path, 20-year-old me reading Cosmic Trigger,
Hmm.
um, blew my mind, literally blew my mind. Because I was a punk rock dude living in Chicago. I was doing LSD. I was really into Sid Barrett, and that whole scene. And my guitar, I was in a band. My guitar player told me, he used to he'd do acid too, but not as much as me. And so he kind of like, he poked fun at me a little bit. And my nickname was Sid with the band. People in the band call me Sid because you're like Sid Barrett, but you take all acid. Get it? I'm like, yeah, I get it. Um, and he said, you should read the Illuminatus trilogy. I'm like, the what? He said, Illuminatus trilogy. Okay. So I went looking for it at the library, but it was, obviously it was checked out or stolen in the Chicago library. But they said, we've got one book by that author, the same author though. I'm like, oh, okay, what's a Cosmic Trigger? That's a weird name, but I'll try it. I took it home and I read it. And then I read it again. And then I read it again.
And
But not very many books in my life that I've done that with. Like read the last page and like, I need to do that again. I
right,
don't want to miss anything. I need to do that again. There's some books that you do that, but not many.
right.
Or even movies. Like there's like four movies in my life that I sat through and then stayed in the theater and watched the next showing and then stayed in the theater and watched the next showing. It's like not many movies does that happen for me, but every once in a great while. And so like Cosmic Trigger was that book for me. And then of course, I had to go on the quest to find Illuminatus. And I couldn't find it in the library. I had to buy it.
Interesting that that's kind of the book that cracked you open, or it was Bob and his writing, and then you ended up stumbling into his world, so to speak, there in
Well,
Santa
that's why
Cruz.
I went to see him at the Zen Center in Chicago, is
Okay.
because I'd read all his books that I could get my hands on by then. Um, I contacted the New Falcon people. I think they were just Falcon at the time. Then they went New Falcon, and now they published me Original Falcon. They published my stuff, um, and I contacted them and found out where their books were sold in Chicago, where I could go to get the Falcon books, and yeah. So that's kind of the path was my guitar player Rodney telling me to find the Luminos trilogy, and then I couldn't find it, but I found Cosmic Trigger, and that I'd never read anything like that. That introduced me to Leary, who I'd heard the name, but I didn't know he was a thinker. I thought he was just some dude that like from the '60s that sold acid or something. I'm telling you what I thought in the '20s. Like
Yeah,
I didn't
right.
I didn't know what was going on. So it introduced me to Leary, introduced me to Crowley, like all these things. It got me into the Golden Dawn. Like all of that stuff happened because, like a guy who noticed that I took acid said that I should read
Check this out.
Luminatus trilogy.
Wow. One of the thing I wanted to, well, many things, but maybe the one that sticks up for me right now is there was I forget the quote, but it was from Rick Rubin, and basically he was talking about making art for one's own self.
Yep,
And you responded to that on Twitter, I believe, and I just
yep.
wanted to bring that up. That sounds like an important topic here.
Oh, absolutely. So Christopher Hyatt,
Hmm.
aka Alan Miller, and I became friends before he died, and we used to talk on the phone a lot.
Hmm.
Um, we shared a love of motorcycles for one thing, and the and Falcon has published some things that I've written, so he was publishing me, has since. Well, he's gone now. Alan's gone, but the Nick is still running. Nick Tharcher is still running Falcon, original Falcon. Um, and he told me something. He said, write at least once in your life, write the book that you think only 64 people in the world will read. And at first I didn't get that. And then I thought about it. I'm like, so what you're saying, Alan, is write a book that I don't really care if it's ever going to sell, but write the book with a certain audience in mind, period. Don't try to, like don't try to like focus group it, to this because at the time, I was I'd taken on an agent at the time, um, and was like doing work for Hollywood and all this stuff, and they were driving me crazy because like my agent would say things to me like, this was like the early 2000s. If you could write a YA novel, I could sell that in a heartbeat. I was like, do I strike you as a YA novel writer, dude? I mean, come on. It's like, no. And so I was telling Alan, like, this is driving me crazy. And he's like, well, it's real simple, Joe. Just write the book you want to write and don't worry about who's going to read it. Write it for yourself. And if you write for yourself, it very well may mean that only 64 people in the world will ever want to read this book, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't write it. And I'm like, okay. And so I took that on as my credo, and that's been my credo of writing ever since. Like, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write this book because this book wants to be written, not because I sat down and focus grouped, like, what do I have to put in this book to get it in front of the most people? What's hot right now? What's the trend? What's selling? What does my agent want me to write? Like, I even fired my agent. I don't have an agent. I've never had an agent since. Only once or twice has that bit me in the butt. In dealing with, media organizations, is probably better to have an agent sometimes. But for the most part, it served me well. And it definitely has served me in that nobody tells me what to write. And nobody's hounding me and like, if you just write this thing, I'll sell it. I can sell this in a heartbeat. I don't go to these classes of, learn to be a best-selling author overnight and all this garbage, because this is what's happened to writing. This is our storytelling. Storytelling is one of the most important things available to the human race because it's how we tell history and facts to oncoming generations.
Myth making.
Right? Myth making. We tell the stories that like, don't go to this part of the woods because there's probably a bear that's going to eat you. And we don't say it that way. We say it in a roundabout mythopoetic way because we enjoy that more and it resonates more with us as humans. And so we tend to remember it better if it's told in a mythopoetic story way. So we tell stories to each other. And we've turned our storytelling over to bean counters. That's really what's happened. We've got a bunch of accountants telling us what to write so we can sell the most tickets, sell the most copies, get the most clicks. You know what I mean?
I'll tell you, I know what you mean because I saw Dune 2 recently.
I haven't yet to see it.
Well, my Twitter feed was blowing up about how great it was, and going so far as to compare it to Star Wars, the original, which I can't even begin to wrap my head around. But it just felt so diluted. And not. They sent him on I don't know, spoiler alert, a little.
Well, I read the books.
Yeah, well, so the movie, they sent him on like the book. Yeah, as usual, the movie diverges a little bit, but they sent him on a wilderness rite of passage.
Okay.
And his girlfriend shows up and helps him through it. Right. I just, that's the moment I lost it. And I just couldn't.
There's a reason you're out there by yourself.
Right. Exactly. Somebody was like, well, Frank Herbert understood mysticism, and the movie does not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, I had a feeling that I probably would only see that when it's streamed.
Well, it's visually stunning and it's epic, and it's worth seeing in the theater for the magnitude of it, and it's just another Hollywood script in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's what, as a writer, especially a writer living in Hollywood at the time and working in the film industry, that I was getting sick up and fed of all that stuff. And so when I read Rick's latest book, I didn't learn anything new, but it was nice to know that there's other people out there thinking like me,
Hmm.
which is Rick is like, just do what do what you have to do, man. Like, don't worry about like what's going to sell, what the trend is. Like, don't worry about that. And it's nice to hear, especially somebody like Rick Rubin, you know,
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah. Uh, Well, while I've got you here, I have to ask you about Ong's hat. And I say that because I surely would have run across it. I spent a lot of time on the Deoxy
Oh
website,
yeah, that's
and
probably where you ran across it.
I would have run into it then in the
Yep,
middle to late 90s.
yep.
I started interacting with you a little bit when you were
Early
running
2000s, I
the
think.
Gray Lodge
Yep,
website,
yep,
and I
yep,
had the Raw
yep,
Fans website
yep, yep.
going. So I would have it seems like every now and then you come across my radar, and I check in, and I'd be like, "What the fuck is Ong's hat?" And I got to be honest, I never could wrap my head around it.
Okay.
Maybe because I never really dove into it. I just kind of looked at it from afar and tried to figure it out because that's
Yeah,
what I do.
yeah.
And
Which is not, you can't do that with Ong's hat.
that's what I figured.
Yeah.
So maybe if you can explain it to me like I'm five.
Well, it's classified as the world's first alternate reality game.
Yeah.
Um, it was an immersive experience. It was definitely my first big artistic endeavor. It was an approach at creating a Swiss Army knife storytelling method. It incorporated all the things that I was interested in at the time, the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So that would have been magic. That would have been at the time. I think Fred Allen Wolf had just come out with his book about chaos. Um, there was I was hanging out with my friend Nick Herbert a lot, so I was getting overdosed on quantum theory and Nick's little cool little twist on quantum theory. And I was hanging out with Hakeem Bey, Peter Lambert Wilson. I was hanging out with Bob Wilson. I was hanging out with like the entourage that comes with hanging out with those people. So like there's, this 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon that you discover that you're in. Like all these people like know each other or know people that know people. It's like so. I was hanging out at Esalen. Um, And so, in fact, this is exactly where I trace it to. I was dealing with all this stuff, thinking about all these theories. I was looking at the history. I was looking at like thinking about the future of book, what a book would mean in the electronic world. Because I was doing bulletin board systems. I was doing HyperCard, if you remember that back in the Mac days. This is right before the World Wide Web. There was something Apple had something called HyperCard,
Mm.
which was hypertext basically, but it was local. It didn't, there was no network to go out to. So all of this stuff was what I was doing and thinking. And then Bob asked me to accompany him to Esalen one weekend, drive him down and help him to be kind of his assistant for this thing he was doing, which was a LARP at Esalen. And it's Illuminati oriented LARP where everybody that came to see Bob for the weekend like got a cabin, like like you do at Esalen, you do a weekend, and everybody comes down, and then and they get this ticket to see Bob doing what he's doing, and we incorporated that his speaking into this overall LARP situation where everybody that was there to see Bob was inducted into the secret society. And
Mm.
sometimes we'd show up at their door, knock on the door of their cabin, and come in and initiate them and give them this shit. So you are now a member of the Assassins. You are now a member. Like we had these groups, and so all these people were like in these opposing groups, but nobody could know what group they could. Nobody could know that what group they were in,
Mm.
or they had to guess if you were in the same group or an opposing group. And so like they ran the whole weekend ran with like these people doing this weird social experiment of LARPing, which was really cool. And so I got to kind of puppet master that whole thing, which was fun. And I think Bob chose me A because I could drive, and B because he knew that I was into the LARPing thing. And so we did that, and it was very successful. People like really, talked it up. Like the last day, like everybody got up and kind of gave their testimonial, so to speak, and like I had so much fun doing this, and I had no idea that my girlfriend, who was staying in the same room as me, was in an opposing group. It's like, um, so I went away from that, and I thought, BBSs had become a thing at that point, bulletin board systems, and I was new. I was fairly new to it, but also bulletin boards were fairly new. So, I was an early adopter. Um, and so I started thinking about, can I use this network computer environment that's out there to do a LARP? And then I ran into this group out of, I think they were out of Tucson, I think I want to say, um, Tucson or Phoenix, um, called Flying Buffalo. And so they did play by mail games. And so you would get into this like so-called LARP, and you would do it through mail, like USPS snail mail and phone
Hmm.
calls. And from that, Steve Jackson evolved and started doing BBS LARP games, the Steve Jackson things. And so I was like, well, of course I can do something like that, but I want mine to be very occultic. I want it to be very like fringe oriented. So it's very weird. So I started putting this thing together, and over the years it evolved until about the like you said 93. I think Dimitri from Deoxy contacted me and said, this stuff that you're publishing online, can I put it on my website? And I'm like, oh, absolutely. Like, go over to the Well Gopher. You can get some text there. So he did that, and they, doing what he did, he like made these wonderful Photoshop imagery and put it all like made it really, you know, appealing visually, which he did well because he was an artist. And if anybody's wondering what we're talking about, Deoxy's back online, in case you wondered. DEOXY.org. Somebody put it back up and restored it. So if you go to deoxy.org/IRC, Incunabula Research Center,
Ah.
that's Dimitri put that up in 1993. He started putting that up. So he used to collect all the Ong's Hat related stuff that I did and repost it there. And so around 98 or 99, I put out a 98, I put out a CD-ROM of all the material. And then I made it very visually appealing. And I put a lot of game oriented rollover stuff and hidden states and Easter eggs and stuff in it. And then there was a 4 or 5 forums that got formed around this, and people were putting forums up. And so it started to be an informal game. There was never any formal rules to the game because what I was trying to embody was the idea of an infinite game,
Hmm.
which I don't think anybody had ever tried before. So I knew what a zero sum finite game was, and God knows we have enough of those. Like, what if somebody was to build something that was supposed to be an infinite game, which meant play for the love of playing, no end to the play, no winners, no losers. And that doesn't mean participation trophies. It means it's not a game that's being played for that. So, like, you get something out of it, but you don't win. You don't play to win. You don't play for domination. You play for the joy of playing.
Hmm.
And something like that exists. And it did for a while. It did. And then a lot of, like, as the internet became more popular and more people started to show up online, um, a lot of people started to show up at the forums that didn't really understand what what an infinite game was, or even couldn't even get their head around the concepts. So they thought it was a finite game, and they started to try to play it like a finite game. So, you know, I had to stop it because there was like, people were like, oh no, I figured out, I got the answer. I figured it out. It's like there
Oh
wasn't
no.
there was no one answer. It's like there's your answer and my answer is different and her answer is different and his answer is different. And so a bunch of people showed up that didn't have the ability to grok that. And so it became unfun. And so I just like, I called it like, okay, well, we did it for a while. It's cool. Like it was a temporary autonomous zone. And
Hmm.
yeah, so we're done.
So then that's something that you could read about or immerse yourself in, but it's not really going on today, so to
No,
speak.
no, no, it hasn't. I pretty much closed it down about 2001.
Okay.
So August
Well,
2001, I shut it down. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And, you know,
that was
the
that.
whole internet changed at that point.
Right.
The complexion of the internet changed. And um, conspiracy theory became a dirty word because, like, Alex Jones really showed up on the back of 9/11. So, you know,
That's what came up to me when you were talking about Ong's hat is like you always get the random conspiracy theorist that shows up in Robert Anton Wilson's world and thinks takes it very seriously. Like,
yeah,
no,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
you're not getting it.
yeah. Well, see, that's what started to happen is like all these people were coming online for the first time. And these were like mainstream middle-aged people from middle America. And so they were reading this stuff and taking it literally. They didn't understand that, like they really didn't understand the tongue-in-cheek aspect of it. They to this day, people write me and tell me like one of the elements of Ong's Hat is the Dobbs twins, right? The children of a aluminum siding salesman from Texas who started a cult, right? And people write to me as if that is like a real thing. They don't get it. They don't get the joke, right? They don't understand that that's a J.R. Bob Dawes reference and tongue firmly planted in cheek, like, like this is a joke. And so they don't get it. They don't get it. So when you're dealing with those kind of people, you know, it becomes unfun, man. It's not fun anymore.
Right. And not only do they not get it, but it's impossible to try to explain it to them.
You can't do it.
It's
I
just
tried for a couple of years. I tried, earnestly tried, and I was just beating my head against a brick wall. And so I don't do it anymore, but I didn't know any better at the time. I was like, really, no, if they just listen to me, they'll understand, like, no, no.
no.
First of all, they don't want to. And second of all, I don't know if they're capable because you have to
Then
have so much background information to get that kind of joke. It's like one of the things I tell people all the time. It's like somebody says, if you could go back in time, you know, with a time machine, what would you do? And okay, I'd go back and kill Hitler in the crib. People ask me that, and I say I'd go back in time and I'd kick the shit out of Jim Garrison before he drove Carrie
oh
Thornley
god,
crazy.
that's that's a great
because
answer.
he literally did because he didn't get the joke.
How the world might be different.
Yeah, yeah.
Jim,
I mean, people don't to this day don't understand how much effect Garrison had on conspiracy culture and therefore in popular culture because that whole theory that he had Garrison like I forget he had a name for it, but it was like basically like if I was living in an apartment on street A and you were living in an apartment on street B and you were like one step removed from somebody involved in the Kennedy assassination, I was also implicated because I lived around the corner from you. That was literally a theory he had. I forget what it was called. There was a name he came up with for
ugh,
it. It was like basically proximity equaled guilt, right? And
right.
so, and that to this day, like conspiracy theorists practice that to this day. When you see people drawing lines, you can literally see the tacks and the string,
Yeah.
like in your mind. You see them drawing lines between the post-its on the wall. You hear them doing it, like you hear them doing it what they're explaining to you, and you're like, oh man, you've got Garrison disease. You really have it.
Yeah, these are folks, I think, that the wires are crossed and then they're just looking for something that they can place on that framework where the wires are already crossed. And
Anything,
yeah,
just something. There has to be something there. No, there doesn't.
yeah,
There really doesn't. So yeah, so um, you know, it was a shame what happened to Carrie. How much of that was put on, I don't know. So I hold out in my mind the hope that he was playing a role. I hope to a certain extent.
yeah.
I knew people that was it Three Corners or what that place he was in outside of Atlanta? Something Corners, Four Corners, Three Corners. Um, anyway, this neighborhood, this kind of a alternative neighborhood outside of Atlanta where he was living on the street, and they tell me that he seemed to be happy. So, and
Yeah,
I know people that live that like intensely intelligent people that live on the street because they want to. So that's okay. But the thing where he came to believe that he was really, used as a secret soldier or something like, I worry about that stuff. But
yeah,
and I think a lot of that was brought on by Garrison, just like pounding on him every time he turned around, he was getting hounded by Garrison, sued by Garrison. Like
yeah. A lot of stress there.
there would have to be. So yeah, that's give me a time machine, I'll take care of that.
I love that. Love that. Maybe that would have prevented QAnon.
Yeah, right, exactly. Although, like if you look back at the history of even the stuff that Bob, Wilson and Shea were writing in Illuminatus, that stuff was all coming out of like pre-existing conspiracy culture then.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, that's true, right? All the stuff they were getting at the Playboy Forum,
yep,
and I think they were just amplifying it.
yep.
And then, yeah, here we are.
None dare call conspiracy, and um, there was like groups. There were like, it goes back as far as even to Revolutionary wartime, but probably goes back in Europe. It goes back beyond that.
Yeah,
So it's always been there. There's always been this need for it. I think that because we live in a hyper media situation now, like
yeah,
we get surrounded by it quicker, and seems like it becomes more amplified, and also because of that, you've got a lot of people. This is what happened in the late '90s. You've got a lot of people that weren't exposed to internet culture that suddenly were on the internet, and they were get exposed to this stuff for the first time, and they hadn't built up the callus yet. They didn't know that you can't believe half of what people say to you online, and you shouldn't, right? They didn't know, so they just like everything was coming at them, and they were just taking it in like fact because all they
yeah.
knew as a training module before that was television.
I think everybody talks about the evils of social media, and I think all that social media has done is brought what was in the closet in the shadows out
Yep,
into the light,
yep.
and here we are. Hopefully, we can work through all those shadows.
So I was telling people like when they were, because I got interviewed about QAnon a lot, like 2017 through 2021,
Mm,
because a
my
lot of people,
condolences.
yeah, thank you. A lot of people were going, "Hey, this QAnon thing's like that Ong's hat thing." I'm like, "No, it's not." So I would do the interview because I normally wouldn't have, but if they were going to run that slant on it, of course I was going to stand up for it and say no, that's not what happened. Um, because none of the stuff that QAnon was saying was new. That was all old conspiracy stuff that had been around forever. It just got aggregated into one belief system.
Mm,
That's all it was. It was just an aggregation of
right.
all that stuff that had been around forever, like the, you know, the reptilian thing, old, even before David Icke, but early internet stuff, all that stuff was around.
Yeah. Well, Joe, I feel like I could keep talking for another couple hours. I don't have the energy for it, but I have the questions. It's been a real pleasure. I think you're online at josephmatheny.com.
Tom? Mm-hmm.
I think the trilogy you were talking about is the Liminal trilogy.
The liminal cycle. It's
Liminal
a
Cycle.
trilogy. It's the most recent edition of Ong's Hat. The beginning is at the top of that page. The liminal trilogy, the liminal cycle trilogy is on the top of that page. So I keep all my newest stuff at the top because people don't like
Okay.
to scroll.
Yeah.
It's JOSEPHMATHENY.com.
Got it. We'll put that in the show notes as well as a dozen other
Cool.
things we touched on today.
And
Anything
then
else you want to?
the book's coming out on the 23rd, right? Reality's what you can get away with.
Should be coming out on the 23rd.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, yeah.
It brings back good memories because that was a cool summer. That
I
was the
bet.
summer we went to Esalen together. Like Bob and I were hanging out a lot during that summer, and so I had a lot of cool conversations in that red Volvo.
I bet. I bet. Sounds like. And you, I guess, produced an event with Bob, the Eye in the Triangle.
Yeah, I produced several, but yeah, that one got recorded. So
Okay, that's the one
the
that's.
the EYE in the triangle that was recorded at my friend's bookshop in Santa Cruz at the um, Avalon Bookstore in Santa Cruz was one of the first to call bookstores, and yeah, we did that. God, 91 somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, then we recorded it, and then I put it out through Original Falcon, and then I made a lower resolution version available for free online at archive.org.
Nice. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right, brother. That concludes the episode. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. A big thank you to Joe for taking the time to chat. I really enjoyed that one. Thank you, as always, to Christina Pearson of the Robert Anton Wilson Trust and Richard Rasa of Hilaritas Press. The next episode, featuring somebody, will release, as usual, on the 23rd. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor e Hilaritas.